Hi friends, this was an activity we were hoping to do with all of you at school, but since school is closed for a while, we thought it'd be fun if we post a video of how to do this activity at home, and hopefully you can get together some supplies and make one of these on your own with your family. So, we are making terrariums today, and a terrarium is really just when you take a little bit of the earth and you keep it in a jar. So we're going to be making moss terrariums because that's one of the easiest ways to get started. And for this activity, you will need a jar, and I recommend one with a really big opening that you can get your hand all the way into. Pickle jars are really good for that. You will also need some rocks or gravel to go on the very bottom of your terrarium. And the next thing is sphagnum moss. And in here I have some sphagnum moss that I've been soaking in water in a bowl. You will need some potting soil, some moss, and some little figurines that you want to put inside of your terrarium. You can use cute little ones like this house that I have, or you can use nature finds that you found, like broken seashells, pretty rocks, things that you have picked up outside. Something else to keep in mind about moss. So you can either buy moss at a plant store, or you can go collect moss. But it's really important that we don't collect all of the moss in one place. We don't want the moss there to stop growing because we took it all home. So a good rule of thumb to follow is the 10% collection rule. All right, if you have 10 cookies, if I were to take 10% of the cookies for myself, that would mean I would just take one cookie for myself, leaving the other 9 here for other people to enjoy. And the same thing works for the moss. If you just take 10%, 1 cookie's worth, of the moss that you find, it means the rest of the moss will have time to regrow and other people can enjoy it in the park too. So when you go out and collect moss, make sure that you're not taking more than 1 cookie or 10%. So let's actually get started on making your terrarium. The first thing you want to put in your jar is some rocks, some gravel. Not super big rocks, just ones that are each about this big. I've seen people use marbles too. Just something that's about that size. You want to fill up your jar until the bottom of the jar is definitely covered and you have a thick layer of rocks on the very bottom. So here I'm going to do about an inch of gravel. Now that I've got my rocks in the bottom, the next thing I want to put in is the sphagnum moss. Make sure you soak it in water first. It makes it much easier to handle within the dry sphagnum moss. So I'm going to squeeze out the water as I pull it out of my bowl. And then I'm going to put it into my jar and make a nice, neat layer on the very bottom. You might have to do some poking and squishing down with your fist. You want to cover all of the rocks while you do it. Alright, so you can see that I have a nice layer of rocks on the bottom and then sphagnum moss on top. On top of the sphagnum moss, you want to add a little bit of soil. You can use potting soil, you can use dirt from your backyard, your choice, and whatever you have on hand. Just going to pour a little bit of that in there. And just kind of press down the soil a little bit so it's a neat layer as well. So now I've got rocks, sphagnum moss, and soil on top. The next layer is the moss. When you gather moss, something to keep in mind is that you want to get moss that you found growing on the ground, not on trees. And the reason for that is There's specific species of moss that like to grow in trees and specific species of moss that like to grow on the ground. Our terrarium is pretending to be like the ground, not like a tree. So we want to make sure we get moss that has been growing on the ground because we're going to put it in a jar and it's going to be growing on some ground. So you can take your moss and gently press it on top of your soil and make sure that the bottom of your moss is pretty neatly pressing right up against the soil. Don't be afraid to mush it around. Moss is pretty tough actually. And you can tear apart your pieces of moss to make them fit better inside your jar. Squish them down until I have a nice layer of moss on top. The last thing, and this part is really fun, you get to put in your rocks, your nature finds, or if you have little figurines or Lego characters, you can put those in too. I have a little house that I'll put in. Put where I want it, so you can see it from the outside of the jar. And maybe a little rock next to it. To finish everything off, you want to add a little bit of water to make sure that your moss is nice and moist when you close your lid. Always keep an eye on that bottom layer of rocks to see if the water starts filling up there. The rocks are for drainage, so they'll be able to take up the water if you overwater your moss. I think that's good. Put on my lid, and I'm done. I've made a lot of terrariums over time, and they can come in lots of different shapes and sizes. You can put whatever you want in them. Just remember that every terrarium is a bit of an experiment. If the moss dies, that's okay. You can go gather more moss later and replace it. If you want different figurines in it later, you can go get some new ones and put them in and rearrange. I can't wait to see what creations y'all make with your terrariums.